I'm not really sure I know the answer to why this
Yeah.
stuff has all gone on for as long as it has, other than it's just easier to look the other way, I think, a lot of times, and people
Yeah.
don't really wanna dig in and do the hard work.
And we're back on the narrative. Mike Andrews, Aaron Bear, David Mahan, joined now by Representative Mike Dovilla, who represents the 17th District in the Ohio House of Representatives, up near the Cleveland area, right, Representative?
You got it, I live in
You,
Berea.
yeah, who all do you represent up there?
So I have Olmsted Falls, Berea, Strongsville, North Royalton, and Broadview Heights.
Excellent, excellent. Well, we wanted to talk to you today because you've been doing a lot of work on the Medicaid fraud that we've heard so much about here recently, and just curious if you can give us kind of a high-level overview of that for listeners who may not be familiar with it, and then if you could just tell us how you got involved in it specifically as well.
Sure, sorry for the dog squeaking here, of course, we get on this, and it's time to play with the ball.
That's what shows that the program is authentic. We love
Exactly
that.
right. Yeah.
We always are. Um, well, where to start? I was just testifying before Congress recently, and I mentioned to Brandon Gill's task force there that I've really been working oversight issues for about 25 years now. I started with George Voinovich back in 2001, and I've been working transparency and accountability and those types of things in government for a long time. And then last time I was in the legislature from 2011 to 2016 was when the Medicaid expansion came along. I was opposed to that at the time back in 2013, devoted a big piece of my budget speech that year on the floor to that issue, and then came back in this time around about a year and a half ago. And not too long after I came in, I had a constituent from Strongsville bring to my attention some real potential fraud issues with the age blind disabled portion of the Medicaid system here in the state. So we began looking into that. That led to the inclusion of provision in the state budget. Well, first of all, I introduced House Bill 356, and then we put that in the conference committee report on the budget to require a full audit of ABD by the auditor. That's been underway now for almost a year. And then, of course, more recently than that, we had the situation break in Minnesota, and then here in Columbus just a couple months ago with Luke Rosiak's story in the Daily Wire. And so it has been a ride and then a real journey through this process, but we're on top of it every day. This is not really the area I expected to be focusing almost all of my attention on lately, but we've certainly put a lot into this, and more to come as we're going forward. Just got Senate Bill 315 passed, and that is really, I think, the biggest Medicaid reform or accountability bill that we've seen the General Assembly ever do since the system was created back in the 60s. So that's maybe a wave tops kind of view of what's going on. I'm happy to dive into any of that a little bit more as we're going along here.
So before we get into what's just been done and what's all been revealed, I think it's a really interesting perspective you've got, having been on the front end, back 10 plus years ago when all these states did Medicaid expansion. And a lot of, I was working in state policy in Arizona at the time, having the same debate saying, hey, don't do this. And now, coming back to the state house and seeing the consequences. Did you just come in with a big "I told you so" banner when you got back here, or was that? But can you talk a little bit about? I think for a lot of folks, they get lost in history of what the Obamacare, and I think that's an important part. The Obamacare state Medicaid expansions, how that sort of set us up for failure here, 10 plus years later for this type of fraud to be happening.
Yeah, I remember sitting down over at university hospitals for a conversation with all the health systems at the time that we were contemplating the expansion through the legislature. And the point that they were making was that emergency departments, one of the points anyway, emergency departments are being used as primary care physicians essentially, and it's the most expensive way to deliver care to people who have no other way of paying for it. So, they show up with a toothache or headache or whatever it is at the ER, and then hospitals have to take care of them. So, wouldn't it be better to have an expansion of the system up to 138% of poverty, put folks on this, pay for it through the system? And I was skeptical at that point for a lot of the reasons that we've seen bear out in the years since, which is you offer something that's free, quote unquote, and don't be surprised when people take advantage of the incentive structure that you've put in place. And it hasn't really done a whole lot to move the needle in the right direction in terms of quality of care, care delivery, other things like that. And but what it has done, as we anticipated, was open up a significant additional avenue for fraud, waste, and abuse in the system because you're flooding the system with all this additional population. Then you layer on top of that an unanticipated, once in a century pandemic, have all these federal dollars that don't exist. Actually, it's all debt money, but all this debt chasing these new programs, and it's free, right? Supposedly, except it's not. And so all the perverse incentives that we anticipated would be part of a structure like this have borne out. And so you got these challenges that go with it. And then on top of that, you layer on significant challenges with illegal immigration into the country. In my view, largely intentionally driven out of partisan desire to push elections one direction rather than the other, and so here we are, right? So nobody should be surprised at what the outcomes have been because you set up an incentive structure to have exactly these kinds of outcomes.
Right.
So Rep, if you could help our audience, if you could just level set with us in terms of, on one side you hear that, they're trying to abolish, the Medicaid system. And then you say, no, we're trying to reform the Medicaid system. What is Medicaid, and are you for abolish or reform? Like, what are we talking about today?
Yeah, that's a great question, David. And I represent a pretty moderate district, right? This is in the old days. This was a 50.3 Republican index. Today, on a day that's sunny and the wind blowing in the right direction, it's a 52.7. They tell me, but this is one of the top competitive districts in the state, and it very much aligns with my practical yet principled way of trying to drive public policy. So I've told people as I've been introducing them to this topic over the last several months, including in the congressional testimony just recently, you could be a bleeding heart liberal and really believe in the efficacy and the viability of social service programs like this and not want to see fraud in the system. Or you could be a fiscal conservative like me who wants to have government smaller in size and scope and expanse across the state and across the country and say, we don't want fraud, waste, and abuse in a system like this. So it doesn't really matter politically or where one falls on the spectrum. I think this is one of those proverbial 90-10 issues where nobody should want to see uh, this system not do what it's intended to do. And by design from the 1960s, when this was created, it's for aged, blind, disabled people, right? Single mothers, babies, elderly who don't have enough money to pay for healthcare or for assisted living. And those are still populations that fall under this program and ought to be supported. And I think that's something that we can all agree to. But, when you have people who are peeling money off the system and robbing us blind, and then in many cases, I think shipping the dollars right overseas to fund regimes that don't like us very much, you can see why we really have a whole intermingled set of problems here that we need to get our arms around from a public policy perspective.
Representative, could I ask before we get into some of the specifics, like general numbers, what are we talking about budget wise in the state of Ohio for Medicaid, and then rough percentage of what we could be looking at in terms of that fraud, waste, and abuse?
Yeah, so I mean, the numbers that we've talked about, we just mentioned this on the House floor the other day, as did Chairman Stewart. This is half the state budget, and whether you're looking at the all funds number or just the state funds number, it's somewhere right in that range. So every $2 we spend, a dollar is going toward this system in one way or another. Some of the dollars that we were looking at in terms of potential fraud in the system from the ABD portion of it, we're running in the anywhere between $2 and $6 billion range of fraud, and then this additional problem where you've got the two zip codes in the Columbus area, we're looking over a billion out of that home health system. So then roll up the numbers across the country. So when we started working the ABD piece in April of last year, Elise Stefanik at the federal level had been tapped to be kind of the congressional point of contact as you're rolling up all the numbers. Uh, this is a lot of money. And with a Republican leaning state like Ohio, you start to look into other places that don't lean our direction and that probably have a lot more of this going on. And you're starting to talk about, as Everett Dirksen said, a billion here, a billion there, and sooner or later you're talking about real money. It's that kind of concept that we're talking about here.
Mike, don't mean to put you on the spot, Representative Dovilla, but when do you remember when you were in the legislature, starting in 2011, what percentage of Medicaid was the budget then? I mean, it certainly wasn't 50%. Do you remember how much
I
this
don't
has
remember
grown?
offhand. I mean, it's been in that kind of 40 to 50 range for a while. The bigger thing for me is the way that the budget has grown just overall, and it's up about, I think, close to 50% in the 10 years that 8 years that I was out, plus a couple since I've been back, which is just incredible. When you know, part of the argument here from the Democrats has been, well, you've been in charge of the state for the last 30 years. So it's your fault if there's fraud, but there's not fraud anyway, is the argument, right? Or the confused narrative. But part of it's right. I mean, they're too clever by half in the way that they position it. But part of it is, yes, Republicans have been in charge of this place for a while, and allegedly conservative Republicans have been in charge. And yet, I represent this moderate district, and I'm probably more conservative in my approach to fiscal governance than a lot of the so-called conservatives who've been running the state. That's a challenge for me, and it's something that I feel the pressure on a lot within the caucus. But my response to it is, well, then let's do something about it.
Yeah. Yeah. So then what was it in this last bill you guys passed? What we had when we just had Parker Thayer on a few weeks ago, and he was talking about how in the home health system, that you guys originally put in this requirement of an app tracker, right? That if you were going to do home health care services, you had to log into an app and track that you were actually at the location where you were doing it and all that. And then the governor, for some reason that we still don't know, maybe now, but we still don't know, waived the requirement that folks using the home healthcare system had to do, which opened up the door for a lot of this fraud. Um, One has that issue. I know the governor passed an executive order on that to reinstate it, but is that issue still relevant in your eyes? And then what was in this bill to address the fraud that we've been going after?
Yeah, so there's a lot of different pieces in there. A part of the bill really took concepts from the executive office that do the oversight, so the attorney general and the auditor. And then, we talked to the department, the governor's office, the folks in the other chamber. So a lot of what ended up in here was based on recommendations that those and other stakeholders came to us and offered. The bottom line is it provides a lot of additional safeguards and mechanisms for those offices to do their jobs. On the home health piece, that part got debated quite a bit as we went through. At one point, when I was not here, when I was in D.C., the piece went in that caused a lot of angst over family caregivers, including those who live in the same home. I'm not terribly concerned about that, and a piece of that, well, all that came out anyway. But we do want to make sure that in the cases where these shell companies are being set up for the pure purpose of saying, "Hey, we're going to come in, we're going to provide this care," and then they don't do it. The offices aren't staffed. There's mail stuffed under the door, so clearly there's nothing going on there. We do want a way of verifying those types of things. So those are the kinds of provisions in a more detailed sense that have found their way into the final version of this package.
Right, though. So why? So you just a minute ago you mentioned that folks on both sides can agree that we don't want fraud, waste, and abuse in any program, right? But yet, for years, we have it, to the tune of billions of dollars. So, like for elected officials or, folks that are managing these large programs, why would they want to look the other way, at fraud, waste, and abuse?
That's a good
What's
question,
the
David.
incentive?
I'm not sure I know the answer to it. I mean, Mike Odioso and I dropped the bill 683 a little bit earlier this session, and Senator Patton's got a companion bill over in the other chamber to try and grant additional authorities to the Office of the Inspector General, so that they could use electronic warrants and essentially have public safety officer type authorities in place to take a look at these things. And interestingly enough, the biggest pushback on it has come from some of the public safety, uh, you know, folks who used to work in that occupational field in the legislature. So I'm not really sure I know the answer to why this stuff has all gone on for as long as it has, other than it's just easier to look the other way. I think a lot of times, and people don't really want to dig in and do the hard work.
And from CCV's perspective, when I hear that we've got, billions of dollars worth of, waste and everything, and I'm saying, okay, well, on the other side where we're fighting folks on gambling and marijuana and all the vice stuff, so we need this to feed, and generate resources. Is the goal to just say, okay, slap everybody on the wrist, we caught you, don't do it again, and then we're going to move forward? Or is the goal to recoup some of these funds? And if so, like, to the tune of how much? Like, how much of these billions of dollars are we gonna be able to get back, if any?
Yeah, the clawback part of this is always harder, and that's the one of the bigger questions that I've been on the receiving end of for a while here, and I have to try to keep myself and keep others in their correct lanes for what it is that we do. You know, I can't drop an indictment on someone. I can't prosecute a crime. I can report it like any other citizen can, but we really need our colleagues and our partners in the executive branch of government at the state level and at the local level to do their job on that piece of it. One thing that we did do in this bill, though, is increase the criminal penalties, both in terms of the dollar amount and I believe in terms of jail time as well, because there are different levels for the various felony F1 down through F5. And we wanted equivalency. There should be no reason why stealing from someone that's Medicaid related is different than grand theft in some other way. So that was a big thing that Josh Williams was pushing that we included in the bill as we were moving along through the process.
Well, and Representative, I don't. Again, this when you started off this story with the story about university hospitals, again, I was in Arizona at the time when all this was going through, and I remember there the hospitals were putting tens of millions of dollars in PACs to get Medicaid expansion through. Right? It was here was John Kasich, there was Jan Brewer pushing it through. They were they were all in on pushing this, and the combination of the medical system and the lobbyists that were saying for them this is huge dollars, and the less oversight on it, the easier it is for their clients. Now, I'm not in a lot of these places you're seeing it's not necessarily the big institutions that are committing the fraud, but they just want as little oversight as possible to because it's easier with less regulation, but then it opens the door for all of these small providers. That's my perspective on it. I don't know how you've seen interacting with some of these large medical systems or some of these large lobbyists on how they go about pushing these things, but that's how I've seen this play out.
Yeah, I remember there was a lot of pressure here in Greater Cleveland at the time from as much from a lot of the nonprofit organizations around the fringes of the health systems as anything else. And I don't remember the exact details of it, but there was one of the groups released a letter to every one of my colleagues in the House right before, based on some position that I had or some statement that I'd made. It was pretty clear where I was on the issue, and they thought they were doing it to try to throw me under the bus. And so I took the thing and said, I waved it around the House floor during the budget speech and said, "Hey, thanks to Group XYZ out there for letting everybody know about it, because this has been my position anyway." And then, as you might remember, we didn't. The provision that went in the budget that time around basically said we need more time to look at this. Right, classic legislative way of punting on something. Well, create a commission, create a committee, study committee, whatever. And then that passed. I think the Senate concurred in it, and ultimately the leadership at that point decided to use the controlling board, on which I now have a seat all these years later as the vice chairman of the finance committee. But they swapped off members on the controlling board in order to get the requisite number of votes so they could pass this massive expansion of government through that entity, which is not the entire legislature. It's not the entire executive branch. It's three reps and three senators and the controlling board president. It was just a really goofy way of doing anything from a public policy perspective. I see so many things that come through there right now, and Stuart and I look at each other sometimes, and so does Bride Sweeney. It's the three of us, and we look at each other and we're like, what does this thing actually do? Like, we
Right.
very rarely turn anything down anyway, unless we really want to make a stink over it, and then we need 4 votes to do it. But here's this massive expansion of government that takes place, and it's run through the controlling board rather than the legislature. It was
Yeah.
a completely outrageous way of doing things, again, under supposedly conservative leadership in both chambers.
Yeah.
With conservatives like these, we don't need liberals helping us. We really don't.
And that's the quote of the year.
Yeah. Well, and that's to me, that's my big problem with a lot of these things we're talking about with Medicaid is that, the press releases that all come out from government 9 times out of 10 is, "Oh, we spent this amount of money on this, we spent this amount of money on this," but there's no, "Hey, these are the results we got from spending this money," right? We did this massive Medicaid expansion, and we were told, "If we don't do it, there will be bodies in the street." There's always gonna be bodies in the streets. I've still not seen the bodies in the
I
streets, but
stepped over a couple of them in the coming off.
well, those are the bodies in the streets that are using the opioids that they got through the Medicaid expanded facilities. Anyway, no, but but is there any sense, any conversation that you're seeing today, especially in light of this fraud, of how do we get to a place that, again, any other business that's like, hey, we're going to measure ourselves in customer served, and the outcomes are the customers satisfied, are they getting what they want, as opposed to just purely activity done?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked, Aaron, because I've got the perfect policy solution, I think, for all of us, and that is my zero-based budgeting proposal that just left the House on June 9th, and I worked hard to get this all the way through, and had to do some convincing, frankly, within my caucus that it was the right thing. And originally, when we proposed this, it was every 10 years we would zero base the entire state budget, starting with the budget to be proposed this coming winter by the new governor. And, as things move through the legislative process, you have to make some changes and compromise on things. And where we landed was we would do up to a third of the budget every cycle. And so over a 6-year period, you're going to get through the whole process anyway. So you're getting through the whole thing in less than 10 years under this new design as it landed. And it's up to the chairs of each of the finance committees, House and Senate, to make the determination which agencies get looked at. And then we pushed back the effective date to 29 from 27. So those are my two concessions on this, but we got it through. Could really use help from whether it's from CCV
Yeah.
or for others out
Christian
there.
business partnership. Yeah. Explain how that'll functionally work for folks, because that's a huge deal based off how budgeting actually happens in the state right now.
Yeah, and enough, as Dunny Isaacson pointed out on the floor during the debate last week, it was Jimmy Carter, of all people, who piloted this in Georgia when he was governor back in the 1970s. Wanted to try it at the federal level, and it didn't work there. But essentially, the way that we budget in government is we take last year's or last biennium's budget, and we automatically, of course, have to tack on 2, 3, 5% or whatever, because government always has to grow, right, guys? It just always has to grow. Well, it doesn't. And so this is the alternative to it, which is to say in this case, every 6 years, the agencies that are selected for participation in this program, the winners, have to go back to zero and justify every program, every initiative, every part of that agency has to be justified. And, there's a federal bill in the process as well, S-181 from Senator Risch out in Idaho, to do this, I think, every few years as well. And they've exempted Department of War and one of the nuclear agencies, which those are topics that also came up on the floor during the debate over the concurrent resolution to encourage Congress to do the same thing. And the concept was, well, you can't do this with these entitlement programs. Well, yes, you can, first of all, because it's not just the programmatic elements that we're looking at. It's all the administrative stuff that attaches as well. These agencies are also, they run themselves, right? So you've got people who have to be paid. You have other programs that are running through the system. There's really no reason anything should be exempted. Everything should be on the table. Everything should get looked at periodically. And I did an interview on this a few months ago with one of the Cap Square outlets, and the reporter said, "Well, don't we do this anyway every time we create a budget?" And I said, "Well, in theory, yeah, we do. But from a practical standpoint, no, we really don't. They take the last budget, they tack on X% and say, have a nice day, and they send it up to us. And then we don't wonder why the budget has grown from like 60 something billion to 90 something billion in the 8 years that I was away. This is exactly
Well,
how that happens."
and the dirty little secret inside the agencies on all of this is, literally, I heard this from somebody last week. Uh, right now, because the fiscal year is about to end in Ohio, and I actually remember seeing the same thing happen when I was in Arizona. Within the state agencies, they're all looking at how much of the money was allocated for us this fiscal year that we haven't spent yet, and they're going to make sure by June 30th, they're spending that so that they can legitimately go back in their eyes, go back to the General Assembly and say, see, you didn't give us enough money this time. We need more. We need to spend more. Because you see, we maxed out what you gave us. Because if they leave anything unspent,
They don't get it.
then it's going to look like, oh, they didn't need that money.
Yeah. Again, it's
Like that.
the perverse incentive that attaches to so many of these programs and practices. When I was first pitching this to the speaker back around Christmas, I had a good phone call with him, and he used an example, and we'll leave the agency out of it that he cited, but he said, when I was in my previous job, as he calls it, because we call him out when he points out that he was the Senate president previously. When I was in my previous job, I I had this agency that came to me, and they only spent like three-quarters of their budget from the last time around, and yet they wanted a plus up of like 25% on top of that the next time around. And he said, "Well, you didn't spend all of what we gave you the last time, and now you want an increase for the next budget. Explain this to me." Well, they don't have an explanation for it other than just, "Gimme, I want."
Right.
Right?
I
That's
can
not really
I can
sufficient for
imagine which
taxpayers.
department that was, but I will leave it off. I'll have to
Yeah.
ask you off the air. But
It
anyway,
might not be the one that you think, but
all
there's a
right.
lot of good candidates, I'm sure, that participate
Yeah.
in that approach to things.
So, Rep, in all of your years of working in this area, have you looked at other programs besides Medicaid? So, like TANF, or other federal programs that are run by the states. Well, specifically about TANF. Have you looked into that one at all?
I haven't in the same way that we've looked into this, other than, when the budget was moving through the process last time around. I participated a little bit in, where we ended up landing on that, and a lot of the programs that were in that bucket took about a 50% haircut from what was being proposed initially. So we did roll things back, but again, it took leadership on our part to try to get the budget where we wanted it to be. But in terms of the fraud, waste, and abuse side of it, I've not gotten into it yet, but there's plenty of greenfield out there in in other government programs, including TANF.
Representative, I'm curious because so much of what we've heard, at least on the left in the loud opposition to even investigating Medicaid, is, oh, you're trying to rob from all these people who need it. When what we're talking about today is something totally different. It's eliminating that wasteful spending that's not even going to help people. But how much do you sense that narrative might be winning and influencing people on the emotional level, to not actually take a look at what's going on and how this money isn't even being used for the purpose that it was intended for?
I think the argument might work in some districts, but I think with the average Ohioan, it just won't, because what we're really trying to do here is shore up the system so that the people who need it can continue to receive it. It's not like I have a tree in the backyard here and I can just keep growing all the money that we need to somehow fill in the gap. Government keeps getting more expensive, and we don't need dollars being siphoned off into these other avenues, fraud, waste, abuse, what have you, whether it's here domestically or, to the earlier point I made, then being wired right overseas. We can't have that approach to it. We're trying to preserve the system so that it is there for those who need it. And when you look at the 39 trillion plus dollars of debt that we have at the federal level, and it's probably more than that when you take into account all these other programs that are off budget, so called, we're really in a fiscal mess as a country. So we've got to get our arms around that at the national level. I'm not at that point. I'm trying to work things at the state level right now and do the best that I can here for Ohio.
Well, as we wrap up here, for our listeners who are motivated to bring change or help bring change, what's the course of action that they can take to help legislators like you that are trying to put an end to this? What's just John Q. Public's role in helping to end this fraud?
Yeah, I think just be vigilant. Every citizen has a role to play, I think, in making sure that we get the government that we deserve. And too often, too many of us don't pay attention until, right before an election comes up. And so it takes active citizenship. I've been involved for the last few years, with this organization called the Jack Miller Center out of Philadelphia, and they're working really hard to put together a set of programs for education at all levels, based on founding documents and the foundation of the country, to get folks aware of this type of regime that we operate under. It's a Republican, small r Republican regime of self rule, not a spectator sport where we sit on the side and let all this stuff happen. And then, oh my goodness, look at the mess that we're in because we weren't paying attention. So that's the broad generic response to the question that you've asked. More specifically on this, it gets to the whole if you see something, say something answer to things. And I hate trite little phrases like that, but in this kind of instance, if you notice that something's going on out there, it might just be a good idea to report it to the appropriate authorities at the local level, or even make us aware at the state level.
Well, Representative Davila, we're so thankful for your service to our state, for your attention to these fraud issues, and certainly wish you all the best as you continue here in the 136th General Assembly. And we thank you so much for being a guest today on The Narrative.